Hello and welcome to IEEE Soft Robotics Podcast. In this podcast, we're going to interview researchers from both academia and industry about their work, thoughts, spectrum, and more beyond that. This is Marwa Edwini, and I hope you will find this podcast useful. If you would like to connect with us, simply send us, and we will be happy to hear from you. And here is my interview. Thanks.
Hello and welcome to IEEE Soft Robotics Podcast. Hello, Professor Karl. Thanks so much for joining us in the Embodied Intelligence podcast series. Such an honor to have you. Thank you.
It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Thanks a lot. Thank you. So first of all, I would like to ask you how you would like to define yourself. For the audience, maybe first time. I doubt everyone knows about you. You are one of the great neuroscientists in history. So if you would like to define yourself, how would you like to define yourself?
But I haven't really thought about that. My day job is a neuroscientist with a special expertise in human brain mapping, functional neuroimaging. My background is psychiatry, so that's biologically why I got into human brain mapping. That's my day job, but my early training also included physics and psychology, with a view to becoming a theoretical neurobiologist. So that's my favorite title. It would be a theoretical neurobiologist. And in past years, I guess one could even generalize that to theoretical biology more generally.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. So I would like to go for your childhood. At each episode, we ask about childhood. We know that childhood is very interesting and how we evolve as adults. So how was your childhood goals, being intrigued in science or technology? Do you have any memories about that, about your childhood?
Well, yes, they're fading now, but yes, I certainly do have some memories. So what I do remember is always wanting to do something which I think in those days would have been called mathematical psychology. So really the physics of how the brain works, the physics of sentience. And position myself in later childhood, at least, to try and get a bilateral education, or maintain it at least in terms of mathematics and physics, but also psychology and biology. So I was, as a younger child, intrigued almost in an autistic way with sort of little animals and the way things worked, and natural things. So a born natural scientist in the making, and then most of my career since that time has been a realization of that ambition to bring maths and physics to an understanding of how you and I make sense of the world, and indeed how we work.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I'm curious how the relationship between what you say, the mathematics of physics, or I'm sorry, the psychology or something like that. How you got interested in the brain? If you have physics and mathematics, I think that's a big question. How we still don't understand how ourselves even work. We don't understand ourselves sometimes, and how this machine is working. How was for you the start to integrate what you're passionate about, mathematics, physics, and the brain? How does this relationship come to be in neuroscience?
Well, I mean, sort of neuroscience, I think, is and certainly has been for most of my career, one of the frontiers of research. Because if you could do small particle physics, you could do cosmology, you could do deep sea exploration, or you can do neuroscience. I mean, these are the great frontiers, the great unknowns, and clearly, being egocentric, the most interesting thing was me and how I worked. So it was almost a no-brainer, an easy choice. So, and I think obviously, like all of us, very much influenced by our parents and our upbringing. So my father was an engineer, so I got my passion for engineering and physics and formalizations from him. But my mother was a nurse who had a particular interest in psychology and read all the popular psychology books. So I'm a product of the intersection of my mother and father doing the physics of psychology.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. So first the question is, what do you think something we don't understand about human brain after all this journey? what's maybe the most important question we don't really understand, or maybe we don't have an answer for it yet?
So I would answer that question by dividing the problems into two areas of unknowns in terms of functional brain architectures. So in my world, there are two kinds of questions you can ask about the brain, and in particular, its functional anatomy, its functional architecture. So not only, what physical and anatomical structures does it present, but what are the dynamics on that structure and what is their teleology. So the two broad ways of carving up that problem is in terms of functional specialization or segregation, and then functional integration. So the questions of functional specialization or segregation are really questions about what bits of the brain do this. How can we understand the modularity, the compositionality of different parts of the brain? So if you were, indeed you probably are, a soft roboticist, you're talking about how do you get all the right modules and the right sort of functionality that can be ascribed to this particular circuit or this particular computational processing or this actuator. So that's one set of problems. The other set of problems is in the integration, in understanding the distributed processing, the message passing. So that is usually understood in terms of connectivity and how the processing in one part of the brain that could be functionally specialized, and that specialization being segregated in a particular part of the brain, hence functional segregation, how that function is contextualized by the activity elsewhere. So that's a slightly deeper problem, and the answers to the problems both of functional specialization and integration are still being resolved. So that's how I would normally think about it. At another level, a level which is not so much a sort of brain mapping perspective on the problems that present in terms of function anatomy, but a more generic level from the point of view of theoretical neurobiology. I think the outstanding problems are reflected in the sort of conceptual turn, at the century or the end of the last century. Actually, interestingly, just given we're on an IEEE, the 3 E's or the 4 E's came to neuroscience. Things like being embedded, extended cognition, embodiment. So the notions that the brain is embodied, and in a very real sense is situated in an environment, and there's a reciprocal exchange with that environment, where you actually go and actively or in an inactive way select the data that you then try and make sense of your world. So bringing that sort of triple E, and if one extends it to literally extension, extending our memory, if you like, by downloading our mnemonic or memory capacity into our iPhones, then you've got a sort of the 4 E's are pressing you to understand how our brains work inside a body and how our embodied brains work inside our eco-niche, our environment. And then you get into even deeper questions about that follow from the simple realization that 99% of our environment is constituted by other creatures and embodied brains like myself. So then you have all the problems of dyadic interactions, theory of mind. I suspect many of the problems that one deals with in robotics, certainly developmental robotics, learning what I can act upon, what parts of my world or possibly my sensorium I have some control over, developing a sense of self and a sense of agency that enables one to act upon the world, and then realizing that I'm not the only actor. There are lots of other actors, like my mother or my father, other people, siblings, and then trying to work out how to deal with a world and make sense of that world that is composed of other creatures like myself. So I think those are the big outstanding problems from the point of view of the neurobiology.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I would like to ask you first about embodied intelligence in that case, because we have a lot of this question in other episodes about the body and the brain, and sometimes you have to, both of them have to be evolved so that we can achieve this concept of embodied intelligence. However, when we look in the nature, sometimes we see creatures, they don't have a body, they see, or maybe they don't have a brain, and they exhibit intelligence. And for us as human, do you think it's necessary to have both of them at the same time? If you can tell us more about how this, the body and the brain, the communication, and how the creature evolved in nature without brain or maybe without body. I don't know if you have any source like that.
Well, that's a very deep question. I mean, there are certainly very viable creatures and animals that don't have brains at certain parts of their life. So Daniel Wolpert, likes to tell the story of certain mollusks that eat their brains. Once they've attached themselves to their favorite rock for the rest of their lives, they can eat their brains because they never have to move anymore. And of course, that's a nice story because it speaks to this inactive perspective that, what is your brain for? It's to move you around. It's to act upon the world. So if you don't actually have to do much acting upon the world and you're a sessile creature, you probably don't need a very big brain. So, I think the problem would be, or the answer to the question, what is the relationship between the brain and the body, could be cast in terms of what is the nature of intelligence, where intelligence is an attribute of creatures or systems or agents or artifacts that have brains. And I think the answer to that is can be found in probably in cybernetics, and certainly more recent formulations of things like the good regulator theorem in theoretical biology. So this is the notion from people like Ross Ashby, one of the fathers of self-organization, that if you are in an agential way acting upon a world in a way that it is to a degree controlled, then in order to control and regulate that world in the service of your survival, you have to be a model of that world. So that suggests that there are certain active agents, artifacts, creatures that are actively engaged and in exchange with the world, that would necessarily have to have a brain-like system that was, if you like, a mini model or a generative model of that world. So, I'm taking my lead here from the good regulator theorem, but of course the notion of a generative model has become very, very central in a lot of theoretical work, not just in sort of artifacts with agency, but in statistics, in all kinds of data analysis, and in particular machine learning, deep learning, or high-end deep learning using things like variational autoencoders. This notion of a generative model to make sense of sensory data or sensations plays an enormously important role. So I automatically assume that the brain is an embodiment or entails a generative model of what that brain has to control, which of course in the first instance is the body, right through from homeostasis and physiology to actually articulating our limbs using our striated musculature, speaking, exchange. So one could then go back and, you were asking before about what are the problems in neuroscience, and I said, well, it's basically a problem of understanding the functional architectures of brains. And you could actually say, well, that is simply the same problem as understanding the form and the nature and the structure of the generative models that we as in people bring to the table to model and navigate our world.
Yeah, that's interesting part. Maybe I'm curious to ask you about, in robotics, you have a concept of redundancy. If something damage happening, you still could function. Would it apply to the brain? specifically, if there's something damage happening, because we have a lot of mental health issues, maybe something trauma is happening and you can't function. Is this concept in redundancy, how the brain can still function even if there's damages happening? There's something, if something exists in the brain, the concept of redundancy.
Yes, no, it's a very important concept, particularly in something called neuropsychology, which is the study of lesion deficits relationships. So usually in people who had a cerebrovascular accident, and you try to understand what that part of the brain that was damaged was doing by virtue of looking at their sort of cognitive or motor or sensory deficits. So two concepts that have been extremely useful in guiding people's interpretation, again, of what can damage to a brain tell you about its functional anatomy or its functional architecture, are degeneracy and redundancy. But there is a subtle difference. So in my world, I think the kind of robustness that you're asking about inherits from degeneracy, a sort of a many-to-one sort of function structure mapping, as opposed to redundancy. So just to try and clarify that sort of heuristically, it would be redundant for me to, in fact, I'll try and do this. I don't know if the videos are working. It will be redundant of me to use both hands to lift a cup when one will do. But having two hands available means that there's a degenerate, if you like, capability there. I can either use that hand or I can use that hand. The function is the same, but there are two structures at hand, literally, to do it. So it's good that I got two hands, because if I damage this hand, I can still lift the cup. But it would be redundant of me to use both hands. So that's quite a crucial sort of concept or way of thinking about the plurality and the many-to-one, the one-to-many structure-function relationships that characterize the brain. Mathematically, it's really interesting as well. So you haven't asked me, but one of the things that I'm famous for is the free energy principle, which in this instance, I think, provides a nice bit of formalism to think about the difference between degeneracy and redundancy. So the free energy principle is just a way of saying that the good models, the models that work, the models that survive, or the brains that survive, or the robots that survive, have to either minimize their free energy or equivalently maximize the evidence for their generative models. So if you were in machine learning, this would be known as an evidence lower bound or an elbow. So it's mathematically exactly the same thing. The reason I'm pressing on this is that you can always carve log evidence or log marginal likelihood into two bits, which is the accuracy and the complexity, or you can carve it another way in terms of the energy and the entropy. And that's quite a nice mathematical image that holds the notion, I think, of degeneracy and redundancy. So on the one hand, if you've got the accuracy complexity divide or carving of evidence, and you want to maximize evidence, you want to maximize accuracy while minimizing complexity, and complexity would be the redundancy. So the principle of minimum redundancy is a principle of maximum efficiency, which is a principle of maximum information transfer. The other way of carving it, though, gets at, I think, what you're interested in, which is the degeneracy part of it, that plurality, that robustness. So free energy is equal to energy minus entropy. So if you want to minimize free energy, you want to maximize the entropy. So maximizing the entropy of our representations is, I think, precisely what gives you that robustness. And one sees that in a somewhat technical sense in machine learning, in the sense that you don't want to commit to a particular representation or a particular explanation for something. You want to comply with Occam's principle and try and keep your explanations or your mechanisms as simple as possible. So in not committing to a particular very specific brittle explanation, you actually are going to have a very high entropy explanation of what's going on that could accommodate this and could accommodate that. So mathematically, what that translates to is that maximizing the degeneracy is one part of maximizing model evidence, which automatically ensures that you don't overfit your data. And if you don't overfit your data today, then your models, your robots, will generalize to the data that they acquire tomorrow. So I think that, or if they were damaged, or the situation changes, or there's a contextual change. So that because you've maximized the entropy of your representations, or maximized, if you like, the degeneracy, then you are creating artifacts or models of a world that will generalize, they will not be brittle, they will not overfit, and they will survive tomorrow, or in a slightly different context. So I think it's a really important issue, but I'm interpreting your robustness really, from a statistical perspective. What does it mean to be robust? Well, it means having that latitude to generalize, and that basically, when you actually write down the objective functions that give you that generalization, you end up with basically James's maximum entropy principle, which is part of the free energy principle. And practically, it becomes very important. If you're using neural networks or deep learning to amortize something in your robot, if you don't take care of that maximum entropy principle, then you're going to run into all sorts of sharp minima, local minima, and you're going to have a lot of time undoing a particular thing that you've learned that just will not generalize to the next context.
That's very interesting. I'm just asking in that case about the trade-off here. For example, you apply for the complexity or accuracy. Do you think we can combine both of them at the same time? We don't have to go for these trade-offs sometimes.
Oh yes, absolutely. That's So because in fact they are combined. And I didn't mean to imply there's a trade-off. You don't have to choose one or the other. So the log marginal likelihood of any, say, sensory data from any human or biological sensory epithelia or any sensors in your robot. So when I talk about the evidence, I just mean the probability of those data, those sensory data, under the implicit model that, say, you or a robot or an artifact had of how those data were caused. So that's just one objective function. That's just one thing. There's no trade-off. But you can just split it. You can just say it is equal to accuracy minus complexity, and you can start to interpret what self-evidencing or evidence maximization or maximizing the marginal likelihood means, maximizing with respect to the structure of your neural network or your robotic brain. It could be the parameters, any attribute of the underlying processing machine that has to have some similarity to the structure of the world that's generating the data that it is trying to model. Any attribute has to be optimized with respect to the marginal likelihood, which is the same as minimizing the free energy. But the key point here is that evidence, the log of that evidence, is just accuracy minus complexity. So you don't have to choose which one to focus on. You really look at the complexity part of it as a cost or a constraint on the imperative to provide an accurate explanation of the data at hand. And if you hold the accuracy constant, then you want to just simplify the model. Biologically, that means you have to actually just close your eyes and think about things until you can find a simple explanation, or you go to sleep and you remove all those redundant synaptic connections or weak connections in your brain. On the other hand, if your complexity is fixed, the degrees of freedom that you have available to provide an accurate account of those data, then you want to maximize the fit, the accuracy. So the trade-off is there for free, as it were. It's just that in some situations, people don't bake into their objective functions the complexity or the degeneracy in the right kind of way. If you forget about that, then you will start usually overfitting, because you're just looking at the accuracy part. Practically, the way that you, if you wanted to balance it to make the generative model fit for purpose for a particular kind of world, if that world is providing extremely precise, reliable data, then your generative model will know that, and it'll emphasize the accuracy part of the evidence automatically. If, on the other hand, your data are coming from very noisy sensors, or that's very unreliable data, then the accuracy part starts to be suppressed in relation to the complexity. You start to rely more upon your implicit priors in the model. So it may help just mathematically just to say that the complexity technically is the relative entropy or the KL divergence between your priors and your posteriors. So literally, the complexity cost, the computational cost, is how much I have to change my mind to provide a good explanation for this sensory data or sensations. It's how much you move your posteriors away from your priors. And if you don't have to do that very much, that's a nice simple explanation that complies with Occam's principle, uses less electricity by Landauer's principle. You know, that's the holy grail, provided that your priors are good enough to provide an accurate account of the data that you're trying to explain. So this this take on degeneracy, i.e. complexity, i.e. efficiency, unpacks at many different levels. Some of them are really quite sort of practically important. So literally, if you've got a high complexity in the sense that you are moving your posterior away from your prior in order to provide an accurate account of the data, that's going to cost more energy. I repeat, via Zielinski equality or Landauer's principle. And you'll be able to measure that in terms of the current drawn from your artifact. Or what we do is we measure the cerebral metabolic rate of oxygen metabolism or the blood flow to different parts of the brain. So the whole basis of brain imaging is precisely this mechanism of belief updating, information processing, where we can see which parts of the brain are changing their mind by measuring the thermodynamic or the metabolic cost, which monotonically reflects the complexity cost or the computational cost. So very closely related to Jürgen Schmidhuber's notion of simplicity and compressibility as the ultimate objective functions. So you can even follow that through to universal computation if you wanted to. Again, this notion of simple, compressible representations using as fewer degrees of freedom or bits of information as possible. And of course, from a Bayesian perspective, that means that in order to, you would interpret that in terms of sort of minimal messages, in terms of message passing, entailed by changing your mind in response to some new bit of data.
That's fascinating. Maybe just a quick question here about the design of, for example, in AI or machine learning, that number of layers, for example, if you want to mimic the human brain, simulating brain, some people say add more layers, but that doesn't really help. I mean, computation will be very expensive. And in that case, from your experience, when you have this kind of, you look at brain, and if you have this abstraction, what could be the most important component or element you think it's just represented instead of going to all these layers or this design? What could be maybe the efficient way or significant way that we can get abstraction? What's the part that you think we can replicate instead of going to the design process? We have more layers to have more computation power.
That's a brilliant question. It actually follows on beautifully from the question about degeneracy and structure and complexity. So this basic rule about getting the complexity right in relation to the quality of the data and the accuracy with which you need to explain those data also holds in terms of the structure. So if you think about the network, let's say a deep convolutional network in machine learning, or just how many hidden layers you have in a sort of I'm thinking here of the work of Jantani in robotics, having sort of slow and fast neural networks, recurrent neural networks generate predicted movements. Then the number of layers is a really important structural attribute of the generative model that determines at a sort of coarse grain level its complexity. So a simple model with a few degrees of freedom will have 1 or 2 layers. A very complex model may have lots more degrees of freedom and may have, to say, 12 layers. So if you then commit to the simple observation that you can trace right back to, I repeat, cybernetics and the good regulator theorem, if you commit to the notion that the best structure, the best architecture is that entails a generative model that has the greatest evidence, then you can just score the evidence with either 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, up to 12 hidden levels or layers in your neural network. And there will be an inverted U behavior of the model evidence, or a U-shaped relationship with, say, the evidence, the variational free energy that is a proxy for that, that will automatically tell you what structure is for this particular artifact in this kind of world. So notice that this is a function of the data. So the marginal likelihood is a likelihood of the data. So the answer that you would get from this procedure is always going to be conditioned upon the kind of data that this robot or this artifact has to deal with. So simple worlds, thermostats will be very, very simple. They'll just need 1 layer. Sort of humanoid robots, soft robots, dogs that have to deal with worlds that dogs deal with, will have to have many, many more layers. So it very much depends upon the kind of data and the sensorium you expect this artifact to handle. Mathematically, this is a really important theme in Bayesian statistics, where it's known as structure learning. Or it's called Bayesian model comparison and selection. So you get exactly the same mathematical problem when you have different models of scientific data, statistical models. So you've got to find the right level of complexity, and therefore what you do is you try to assess the evidence for a simple hypothesis and then a more complicated one and a more complicated one, and at some point your evidence will keep on going up, and then it will come back down again as you overdo it. And again, we get back into the realm of overfitting, and the model won't generalize. So getting that sort of the right number of levels as a key architectural attribute of a deep network is a beautiful example of in principle being able to use structure learning or Bayesian model comparison to actually get that right. So the hierarchical, if you like, architecture of brains and neural networks is probably one of the most important structural attributes that determine the complexity and the degrees of freedom. But there are others, but I think that's probably the most important one. So how many hierarchical levels do you think your brain has?
Oh, that's yeah, I don't know, maybe a million or more. I don't know what's the right answer.
6. I think it's 6.
Okay, that's embarrassing. I didn't know.
I'm just joking. No one knows. I was just teasing you.
Okay, that's interesting. And I'm just asking in that case about maybe a quick question about modeling, because I think how level of complexity for the modeling? For example, we speak about sometimes modeling so tricky sometimes to capture all the physics happening. For you, which level of complexity go for the modeling to make sure they give you this kind of insight instead of going, what kind of level of the complexity in the modeling you go for when you try to model that?
Right. So, I mean, there are two ways of answering that question. The first one is the complexity is not something you choose. The complexity is optimized in relation to the evidence. So, as a statistician, and I have to now choose between a number of models, they would now become, say, a null hypothesis, an alternative hypothesis, and I will choose the one that has the greatest evidence. That's just standard statistics, and we do that all the time. And actually, modeling neural networks in the brain, we actually create little mathematical models of distributed neural networks, and we explain the data as measured in terms of more complex and less complex dynamic causal models, we call them, and we use the free energy or the marginal likelihood to score the model evidence, to score whether we need this extra component or this extra node or this extra edge or connection or not. So practically, that's how as a data analyst, a data scientist modeling data, you would proceed. You'd use Bayesian model comparison, aka structural learning. But I suspect your question was slightly more when doing simulations to try and build intuitions or provide proof of principle. What kind of models do you find do you find the most useful? And I think that probably reflects the agenda at hand. I have to say, in my world, it's much easier than I suspect in your world. In my world, you can provide proof of principle with really very simple examples. So you're just trying to provide a worked example as proof of principle, and then you say, let an engineer scale it up into a working artifact. So I don't have to worry about that. I can get most of my simulations onto one page of MATLAB script or equivalent sort of high-level language. And of course, the things that we want to explain are framed by cognitive neuroscience and to a certain extent psychiatry and neurology, how the brain might go wrong. So we're interested in the paradigms that you would normally see applied in the lab or in the psychology testing room. So eye movements, how do we choose where to look? Do we look over there or do we look over there? How do we make decisions in economic games? How do we understand language? So focusing on sort of simple, well, they're not simple, incredibly difficult problems, but they don't, they're just focusing on the fundaments of a particular cognitive or motor or sensory capacity that we want to understand more deeply, which is not quite the same, I think, as the challenge that people in robotics take on. And I think that, I got, personally have an enormous respect for robotics, or particular neurorobotics that tries to answer the same kinds of questions, but does so under the constraint of actually realizing the artifact. Because, of course, in the realization, you come back to this sort of 4E's situated, all the real problems suddenly present themselves, and you can't get away just by providing cheap and cheerful proof of principles. So if I was a younger man and had more time, I would probably like to use models that do deal with the very high dimensional real world kinds of data, sort of, how do things move around, modeling contact points and, in a realistic way. Whereas at the moment, what I actually do is just completely work in silico and just move around little toy grid worlds and say, well, this is it could work like this. So in principle, but no one's actually shown it to work like this. The fond hope, of course, is that people will, and I think they are certainly, I repeat it, in my world, from my perspective, a lot of the high-end theoretical modeling based largely upon this variational free energy formulation of what is a good model and how do you make sense of data and act in a way to secure the best kind of data. Some of those theoretical notions are now being looked at seriously by the robotics community, and they are now starting to scale it up and to build much bigger, much more complicated models that can actually handle real world data from that are actually sensed by real world artifacts.
That's interesting. Yeah. Maybe I'm curious to ask you, because we're close to the end, and I think this question we want to ask you about, we see there's other component element, like we have the brain and we have the body, and brain is affecting, but sometimes I have this gut feeling, for example, or even in, I'm reading the book for Eckhart Tolle about the power of now, and he speaks about the mind, that you are not the mind, and what's called being is something beyond the mind and body, and it's something mind-blowing for you. I don't know if you read this book now. How do you interpret this thing? Because we don't have explanation about that thing. This how we can embed that in robotics. If you have this scenario like that, and everything seems right, but your gut feeling tell you it's not right, and it turned out to be right. It's not right yet. So how we can do that? How we can encode that in I don't know, models or robots? How do you explain it as a neuroscientist?
Right. So I think there are two ways you could approach that. The first is to take one's lead from your phrase gut feelings. And the second one is to pick out your focus on agency as an attribute of self and a sense of selfhood, or at least a minimal sense of selfhood. So perhaps we should talk about those two things separately, but in fact, I think one is a facet of the other. So the gut feeling thing is fascinating, so let me just put this in context. So when one applies this sort of self-evidencing, finding the generative model that has the greatest evidence, or minimizes variation-free energy into a more biological frame, it's sometimes called active inference. So it's basically like active learning and active sensing, but slightly more general, in that it covers both sort of inferences about states, as in active sensing and active vision, and active learning about the contingencies, the parameters of a generative model. So active inference is just the notion that you are changing your internal representations in a way that provides the best posterior probabilistic belief or representation of or explanation for the causes of the sensory input. But you also have to do the action part, and the action part is usually understood as acting to optimize exactly the same quantity. So the sort of the heuristic way of looking at that, I think, is most easily framed in terms of prediction error. So loosely speaking, under simple Gaussian assumptions and continuous variables, the free energy, which is the negative marginal likelihood or log likelihood, is just a prediction error, the residual error squared. And that means that you can summarize all good sentience and good behavior in terms of minimizing prediction error. So you can do that one of two ways. You can either change your mind to make your predictions more like the sensory input, or you can make the sensory input more like the predictions. And if you just unpack the latter way of minimizing prediction error, what comes out of that is a simple reflex. It's basically, you've got some equipment, some reflexes, some servo mechanisms in the periphery that receive a top-down prediction from the brain, and then they change their configuration. If there were a muscle, they would stretch or relax. If there were a gland, they would secrete or not, until the configuration of that actuator matched the top-down prediction of what I would feel if I was moving like this or I was secreting like that. So we've just described a classical motor reflex as the device or the artifact that we are equipped with, that minimizes this prediction error simply by realizing top-down predictions of proprioception, of the sensations that we get from muscle actuators. And of course, I can't resist saying and assuming that that's exactly how robots work. It's effectively closed loop control in the periphery that's deeply informed in a sort of vague open loop way by lots of machinery that's going on. But in terms of actually moving, you're just basically sending down the set points that you want to attain for the next movement. And that's exactly how the human body works in terms of spinal cord and cranial nerve reflexes. What you can do, and the reason I went into that is because exactly the same rules apply not to motor reflexes and actuators, but to autonomic reflexes that produce the gut feelings. So exactly the same physiology and maths works when you're not dealing with proprioceptive movement-like sensations, but intraceptive gut feelings. And that's called intraceptive inference. So intraceptive inference is active inference for gut feelings, but exactly the same mechanism applies, that you have a prediction of how you're going to feel, and then your autonomic reflexes, your sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, change in a way to reproduce the sensations that you predicted you would feel, which provides a nice circular causality in terms of feelings. So, are you anxious because you can feel your heart racing? Or is your heart racing because you're feeling anxious and you predict, or your brain predicts, so when in a state of anxiety, then your heart will accelerate, ready to either fight or flee or some other sort of evasive behavior. So there's a lot of neurobiology, underneath the hood here in terms of this intraceptive inference and understanding the deep engagement between the brain and the body, but in this instance, the physiology and the gut and the heart and the lungs, that I think underwrites a really important aspect of our lived world and sensed world, which may be lacking in robots, and that is the gut feeling. So if you wanted to reproduce that in a robot, you'd really have to have some physiology, equip its body with a real physiology that mattered in terms of its moving around, like so the temperature of its actuators or the voltage that was currently being applied, that it could regulate and predict how it would respond in different situations, so that it might anticipate, I'm going to have to move in the near future, which means that you may want to turn up the voltage on this, and then I predict the robot will predict, oh, the voltage will be increasing, and then it will feel that differences in resistance, or you would have resistance sensors, so it would feel and secure evidence that yes, it's now reset the voltage. So it would now, even though looking at it from the outside, you wouldn't see anything happening, but it would feel a change in circumstances that it predicted itself, and then you might equip a robot with a sense of intraception. So that's the gut feeling part. But in doing, in sort of understanding gut feelings as an integral part of inference about the world, where most of the world is in fact your body, in sort of just drilling down on that, there's a clue as to why selfhood is a necessary aspect or umbrella that would require you to or would at least be mandated in very sophisticated robots or people or artifacts, if they had to make predictions, not just about their gut feelings, so the voltage supply or the heart rate, but also the way that they deploy their other sensors, their extraceptive sensors. So where do they look? Where do they physically move? That means that you've got this representation in the generative model supplying all these predictions, some of which are being realized through reflexes and servos and sort of closed loop control. Some of them are just pure predictions, but the key thing is they're all, if you like, joined in the middle, because the generative model has to supply the predictions to all modalities. And of course, once you've got this kind of representation, which is amodal, that necessarily has the gut feelings, you start to think then, well, what is a good description of a representation of the consequences of an agent acting in multiple modalities? And the answer is in the phrase that I've just uttered, it's an agent. But notice it's one agent, a singular self agent. So as soon as a robot starts to have the hypothesis, I am an agent, it can now start to generate and control and produce all these predictions in the different domains that will synchronize and harmonize the gut feeling part of it, the electrical, internal electrics of it, but also, you know, the orienting response, say in terms of where it's looking, a change in the posture, possibly a movement. But to be able to do that, it has to have this singular agential representation. And you start to then get a sense of, well, perhaps just having this singular agential representation, generating all these predictions, some of which are realized, is the basis of a minimal selfhood. So you wouldn't, a virus probably wouldn't need that, or some, you know, a creature that didn't have to, if you like, coordinate its interoception, its exteroception, its proprioception, would not need this synthesis. You don't necessarily need to have a sense of self, but coming back to simple explanations with minimal complexity, then just the hypothesis that it's me, I am a self, and I am an agent, and I cause this, can sometimes provide a very accurate explanation for what's going on. And you know, clearly you and I have this capacity. Possibly, you know, sort of lower order animals also have this capacity. At some point, you don't need it if you were a virus or something. So I would imagine that a robot that suddenly was confronted with actually regulating its own electricity or energy supply, and at the same time was able to attend to various sources of information that were multimodal, I think it would necessarily have a very elemental sense of agency, and in virtue of that, a minimal kind of selfhood.
That's very fascinating. Thanks so much for doing that. I think that's mind-blowing to understand all this in detail. So thank you for sharing that. Thank you. So maybe because we'll close the end, what could be question we have to contemplate about it for robotics? If it's, yeah, when we speak about embodied intelligence, do you think that's something, the way we have the brain is already soft, and we speak of soft robotics, do you think everything has to be resemble where we have already incarnated our bodies? How do you see the next generation for robots? Do you think, if you see what we have already now, what could be a question you can, you can say that we have to contemplate about it?
I think that's a really important question. I'm just thinking about trying to provide, you know, an intelligent answer to it. So, I mean, if it's right, if this sort of notion of, and I keep coming back to sort of the good regulator theorem and the notion of a generative model is correct, so that the best models and the best embodied models and the best robots and the best artifacts are simply those that can reproduce an internal model of the world in which, you know, which they have to navigate and exchange with, then that puts certain constraints on the structure and the form of the brains at hand, and in fact the bodies. You know, the body, you know, coming back to this inactivist aspect, this embodied aspect, then, you know, from the point of view of soft robotics, there is a natural motivation, I think, for working towards the kind of body, and possibly also the kind of embodied brain that best reflects the environment in which that robot has to operate. And, you know, some very simple observations ensue from that. If the robot is there as, you know, so a robotic carer, or you're anticipating it playing the role of, you know, a carer or, you know, say a pet, then the world it has to navigate is actually going to be largely dominated by people like, things like you and me, which are soft-bodied creatures. So, you know, there has to be an isomorphism here. You know, it's a very simple argument. There's got to be an isomorphism from the between the artifact in a world and the implicit or explicit generative model that is entailed by the artifact and the world itself. So if the world is a world of biology and soft-fleshed creatures, then, and you want that robot to be part of that world, then that robot must also be composed and be isomorphic to that. And one can go even further than that, in terms of thinking about, thinking about sort of neuromorphic computing. Could you take the sort of the soft robotics right to the edge where you've got cell cultures that are actually replacing your variational autoencoders? And I think there are good reasons why you might think that's going to work. And again, these are very simple arguments, but and ones we've already rehearsed. Remember before we were saying that the best kind of computation, the best kind of belief updating, is that which minimizes the complexity, and which is reflected in the complexity cost and the thermodynamic cost of a computation. That tells you immediately that the best kind of neural networks for your robot are the ones that use the least energy. And if you compare the two neural networks, a sort of, say a deep learning machine that's categorizing some input with with an in vitro neural network, a tissue culture, or some synthetic version of it, simplified neuromorphic computing, then the power consumption of the neuromorphic computer is usually orders of magnitude less than the power consumption of the deep neural net. So you just know from basic thermodynamics and basic information theoretic principles that that's probably the biological, the soft version is probably the thing that's going to survive, in the sense that it's going to have the biggest marginal likelihood. And in other words, it's more likely you're going to find that there next year than the energy hungry, over-engineered, overly complex deep network. So I think there are simple answers. They're not very compelling, but I tried to make them principled in the direction of soft robots.
It's interesting. That first of all, very fascinating. I think you played it brilliantly. I appreciate what you said. I think it's very intriguing, this question, to be in robotic context. So thank you for doing that. It's very interesting. So maybe ask you about your aspiration. Maybe from what you're doing, what is your aspiration? Something you still aspire to achieve?
Oh, right. Well, at the moment, I'm spending most of my time worrying about the coronavirus epidemic. So at the moment, I'm serving on the Independent Sage in the UK, which is taking about 99% of my time. So I haven't really thought about aspirations. I think when the current pandemic or epidemic phase of the pandemic is over, then what I would like to do is, it's very indulgent, but just to tidy up the high church of the maths behind the free energy principle as it applies to non-equilibrium steady states. So just go back to the key constructs in terms of the statistical physics behind all the theorizing that we've been talking about. There are still some unresolved issues that, interestingly, rest upon the probability distributions over three kinds of variables, sort of outside states and inside states, and crucially action. So we come back to this inactive thing again. So, often cast in terms of three-way mutual information. I don't think that's the right way to go, but I do think actually having mutual information's degeneracy, efficiency between the inside and the outside of a robot, or you and me, conditioned upon action. That's, I think, if you like, the last piece of the mathematical puzzle, which I would aspire to solving next year when I have time.
Wonderful, wonderful. And we ask all our guests whether they think ego is important for you. Do you think ego is sometimes important for you?
Ego?
Yeah.
Yes, I'm sure it is. You're talking to a psychiatrist, so I probably interpret ego in a slightly different way from you. But in the layman's, in the folk psychology sense, no, it is certainly important. We all have self-models, and we all have expectations about the kind of thing we are, and we play to that, and we try to fulfill those aspirations and predictions about what I will do if I'm this kind of person. And of course, that kind of person is usually defined by your ego.
Great. And what could be the most important quality you have gained while, in this work, and you have to maintain? What could be the most important quality you have to maintain?
I think focus on the on the big questions, the big unknowns. Always listen to everybody. Everybody has something useful to say, but as long as it is heard in relation to the big questions, the important questions.
Wonderful. Yeah. And lastly, what would be the best advice that was given to you and was it life-changing? Whether professionally or personally, the best advice was given to you.
The best advice, it's a rather trite answer, but the best advice was the advice given to by my father to me when I was about 13, when he told me to read Sir Arthur Eddington's Space, Time and Gravitation. I won't explain why, but it changed my life.
Okay, that's great. Yeah. And because we couldn't end, do you have any final words you'd like to say for the audience listening to you? Any final words you'd like to say?
No. I've spoken far too much already, but
Okay.
You're brilliant in terms of teasing out all my favorite issues. So thank you very much indeed.
So thank you once again, Professor Karl. It was such an honor to have you, and I really enjoyed listening to you. So thank you once again for your time. Such an honor to have you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. Bye-bye.
So thank you.